Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we'll be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
This week marked the centenary of the birth of Elizabeth II, a monarch who looms especially large in the period of history that we tend to speak about on this podcast. Television, radio, the internet, it's been full of reflections and tributes looking back at the late Queen. And for this episode, we didn't want to just repeat what others may have already said, but instead wanted to try and ask, on what occasions did she act politically? And alongside that, how legitimate is it for a monarch to act politically? We're quite used now to this idea, and it's in part a product of this second Elizabethan age, that the palace and the monarch must act in strictly non-political ways. But actually, part of what I want to argue in this podcast, at least, is a bit of a challenge to that, by looking at some of the ways in which I think monarchs not only can act politically, but in fact at times must, but how it has to avoid party politics. So that's rather what we thought we'd discuss in this episode.
So yes, both of us are, I would think it's fair to say, constitutional monarchists, although I think we probably differ slightly in our sense of the political nature of the monarch. I tend to take the view that the monarch should be effectively totally subservient to the political direction that is set to the monarch by the elected government of the day. I'm perfectly comfortable with the monarchy. I don't think a monarchy is incompatible with socialism. Certainly when Beatrice and Sidney Webb wrote their constitution of a socialist Britain, they explicitly put in it that they thought the monarchy would be perfectly compatible with a socialist political economy in the country. We've done episodes in the past about Labour and the monarchy, and about how in some ways actually the monarchy is a kind of, I would argue, is almost like a pre-capitalist institution and can provide a useful function for a left-wing government, and indeed the monarchy has provided a useful function for left-wing governments. But the reason for that is not because the monarchy is itself left-wing or right-wing. It's because, in my view, it's very, very important in our constitution that the monarchy sits above politics, and it should be an institution that both left and right should feel shows no particular fear or favour towards. And so one of my concerns would be, when we are talking about a political monarchy, that if we say that the monarchy can be political, that in fact can endanger the monarchy, because then it can be seen as showing a preference to a particular viewpoint or set of policies that then makes it a partial monarchy rather than a monarchy that belongs to us all.
I think it probably is the case that whilst we're both constitutional monarchists, I'm rather more committed to the idea in its fuller form than you are. It was once said that Queen Mary was the last person to truly believe in the divine right of kings, to which I think, not whilst I'm alive, she wasn't. But joking aside, what I want to try and do in this episode is really show that the nuances of what it means to be political are actually quite significant. And that if you're in a role like the head of state, then in fact, a big part of what you have to do is unavoidably political. And some of the quite glib ways in which we often hear the role of the monarchy and their relationship to politics discussed are actually much more multifaceted and complicated than we may first think. So in preparation for this episode, I was thinking about what are the ways in which a monarch may be political, and in particular Elizabeth II may have been political. And I came up with 7 categories of legitimate political commentary or action on the part of the monarch. I'll come on to the 6 of those in a moment, but the first of them is one that I actually want to dismiss and put into a slightly different category, really, because the times when the monarch is speaking most politically are in fact times when we know they are not using their own words. So those who don't live in the United Kingdom or some of the other Commonwealth realms may not know, but there is a convention in Commonwealth realms in particular to have the speech from the throne. We call it otherwise the King's Speech, the Queen's Speech, or the state opening of Parliament. The monarch attends Parliament. Members of the House of Commons are requested to go to the House of Lords. Members of the House of Lords are there in their full ermine, with their fur collars and their red robes. And the monarch will deliver from the throne in the House of Lords a speech which sets out the government's legislative agenda for the year or the parliamentary session ahead. These are often strikingly political because it's the government that has written the speech for the monarch. In the seconds before they read it out, the Lord Chancellor very often will step forward, deliver the speech to the then Queen, now King, and they will read it out. But like I say, these are things which we can dismiss because whilst they are the most explicitly political comments that are made by a monarch, they are ones where everybody knows that they are not, in fact, their words.
But is there a bit of a dance there? I mean, how far can a government push it in what they get her to say from the throne? I mean, I was just trying to wrap my brain about when Blair first got elected. I seem to have in the back of my mind that he got the Queen to say something that raised an eyebrow or two, but maybe he didn't quite get her to say, we were elected as New Labour and we will govern as New Labour. How does that work? I mean, obviously the Queen is saying things that are the government's words, not hers, but at the same time she can't be a complete ventriloquist puppet for the government from the throne, I presume.
That's right. So there's definitely back and forth that goes on about the content of the monarch's address from the throne or the speech from the throne to make sure that it's done in ways that do not fundamentally undermine the dignity of the monarch in having to read those out. In many ways, I think of the state opening as being a merger between the dignified and the efficient bits of the Constitution. That old Baghotian distinction with the monarch as the dignified and the executive and parliament as the efficient. Well, this is the moment when the dignified has to give voice to what the efficient side is going to do. And it's a tricky balancing act, undoubtedly. And in the lead up to the state opening of Parliament, there is definitely back and forth about what will be the substance of the speech. And certainly would be objections raised from courtiers if something was included that they thought was really too much.
So you said there were 7 contexts of political activity or perceptively political activity from the monarch, and we've just gone through one. What are the other contexts?
As I was thinking through this episode, and in particular trying to unpack what does it mean for the monarch and what did it mean for Elizabeth II in particular to be politically neutral, I started to think about the different examples where they could speak with their own voice, but in a way which it would actually be quite hard to construe as anything but political. Now, the key thing is, of course, that when we talk about political neutrality for the monarch, what we certainly all mean by that is that they cannot be biased in a party political sense. It would be outrageous and unconstitutional for the monarch to say, well, I don't want a Labour Prime Minister, therefore, in spite of their majority in the House of Commons, I won't appoint one. I mean, that is unimaginable. All of us would agree on that as a fairly basic point. And then there's the state opening, which I mentioned, only to dismiss it. But then the 6 other cases for me are, firstly, before they are sovereign themselves, so that there is this distinction between being the sovereign, the monarch, and being heir to the throne or just in the family, just in the royal family, that the requirement to be politically neutral is diluted for the rest of them. Secondly, and this is particularly relevant for Elizabeth II and her predecessors, when the role, and in particular the exercising of the royal prerogative, requires some element of political judgment. We'll come on to some examples of that. The third is when there are moments when the monarch has to defend themselves and their own role, in particular with internal discussions and dialogue with the government. So an example of that might be the civil list and the funding for the royal household, or say the funding for repairs to Buckingham Palace, etc. Unavoidably, when the palace and those around the monarch are engaging in those discussions, they're to some degree engaging in a political discussion. I think it's legitimate for them to have. Fourth is when the monarch might say something which basically reflects a political consensus. So things which are broadly uncontroversial are generally considered okay things for a monarch to say. But of course, what is controversial one day can easily not be the next, and vice versa. So these are things that change. The fifth example, and we'll come on to unpack all of these a bit more, is when the monarch has a dual role or a dual mandate. So, for example, being head of state of the United Kingdom and head of state of other realms and territories, and supreme governor of the Church of England and head of the Commonwealth. These are roles which are, of course, to some degree all connected, but are also distinct. And there are times when fulfilling one of those roles conflicts with what might be a form of political neutrality or expected neutrality with regards to another. And then the sixth is social or moral issues. Now, whilst they are not explicitly political, of course, they do overlap somewhat with politics. And I also think there is more flexibility about how a monarch considers the issues and speaks about them publicly. Now, just before we move on to them in detail, one thing I do want to say is that even though I think these are all areas where some small p political action on the part of the monarch is legitimate, that is not the same as saying that there is an absolute right to act politically or in a maximally political way in each case, or that it would be wise to do so. Now, part of the judgment of being sovereign, and it's a judgment that Elizabeth II, I think, made pretty impeccably throughout her 70-odd years on the throne, is to try and judge what is the suitable, least controversial, most agreeable way to fulfill these roles without upsetting the apple cart, so to speak.
So first of all, Lee, I want to congratulate you, I think, on this collection of contexts in which the monarch exercises some political role. There may be scholars who have done something like this, but it's the first I've sort of seen this list in this way, as I understand that you came up with it yourself, and I think it's quite good. I don't fully agree with it, but just to very quickly summarize those. So the monarch can speak politically in the context of when the monarch is the mouthpiece of the government in formal ceremonies of state, when the monarch is not yet the monarch, but is the heir. I'll come back to that in a second. When there are choices the monarch must make that are inescapably political and no one else can make them because the monarch has to fulfill a constitutional role. When the monarch has to defend the monarchy, interesting one. Consensus statements that basically everyone agrees with, so there's no political controversy. When the monarch has conflicting political identities, head of state, head of commonwealth, head of state of different realms, etc., and moral issues. I think these are mostly plausible, but let me just push back on a couple of them. The first is the heir. I understand that there is this view that the heir can be a bit more political than the monarch, but I've never really thought that to be particularly wise. And I think, generally speaking, I think that no working member of the royal family, whether they are the direct heir or 10th in line to the throne, should be making comments on matters of political controversy, full stop. Now, you say it would be unconstitutional for a member of the royal family to advocate for a particular political party, and I agree. I think it would be outrageous if Princess Anne came out tomorrow and said vote Conservative, although I'm sure you'd be delightedly.
Not for the sake of the monarchy, I wouldn't.
Well, no, quite.
But I'd be glad to agree with the Princess Royal.
But I think about, for example, even when you have had people marry into the royal family like Meghan Markle, and of course, as a private American citizen, she had made all kinds of political statements before she married into the royal family. I think it would have been wholly inappropriate for her, even as the consort of the heir of the heir of the heir, to continue to make the kind of political comments that she had made as a private citizen. And therefore, I think it's definitely true that even someone who's not directly up for the monarchy should also refrain from making comments that are of, I think, any controversial political nature.
Well, I rather think it depends upon what we consider to be political. There was an acknowledgement from the now king when he was Prince of Wales and did a series of interviews on his 70th birthday that he would act differently when he was monarch compared to how he acted before, in terms of his campaigning, for example, on environmental issues. Now, they were issues that were not strictly meeting with a political consensus. The environment, they're still not today, and where they can be seen as being somewhat political. But I think it was legitimate for him to take an interest in those. Similarly, I think the Prince and Princess of Wales take an interest in homelessness and do work on trying to reduce homelessness. That is to some degree political. You know, homelessness is a consequence of economic and political decisions or non-decisions that are made in part by government. Certainly when they're involved in that, they're involved in something which is not directly and contentiously political, but which is to some degree undeniably political. And even on the Meghan Markle example, it was not unreasonable, given that she had been quite clearly and was a committed feminist, however she may have chosen to define that. It was not unreasonable for her to do things as a member of the royal family, talking about advancing the rights of women and girls, even though feminism is not in and of itself a settled position for a lot of women, let alone the entirety of the political class or the nation of the UK. So I do think the duties on members of the royal family, whilst they're under this broad umbrella, not to be party political or overly controversial, I do think they get more latitude than the sovereign themselves.
See, and this is where I think we do differ. I mean, I feel somewhat uncomfortable with the fact that these members of the royal family have entered into these areas. I think they can slightly get away with it if they can argue that effectively they talk about these issues in such broad ways that they are at the level of consensus rather than controversy. But I think as soon as they enter into any particular policy view within those issues, I think that is territory they should not be in. And I think it has caused problems actually for the king, that the fact that he was so outspoken on climate change when he was Prince of Wales has meant that there were points of friction, particularly with the previous Conservative government, over climate matters, because people knew that the king did not agree with the views of his government. And I think that is actually a problem for the monarchy. If you had Prince William, the Prince of Wales, going around the country saying, let's open up the borders, let's welcome as many immigrants as we can fit into this country. And you say, well, you know, he's the heir to the throne. It's not a particular policy view of one party. It's just a general view he takes. Or if there was another member of the royal family, maybe his wife went down the country saying there are too many immigrants in this country, we need to get rid of them. I think that'd be wholly inappropriate. So I think only to the extent that they touch into these policy issues, it has to be at the very most, the most broad and general matters.
If I may, you've taken all nuance out of that altogether, though. I mean, what I was talking about is how we have issues which are subject of open political debate. For example, how do we protect the environment? How do we look after homeless people or reduce homelessness? As themes that members of the royal family might get involved in and encourage creative thinking in and set out broad views about where they want us to go. That is not the same as taking the most salient issue in British politics, immigration, and coming out with explicit policies about it, which is not what I'm suggesting that somebody would do. It's the reason I made this point before, there is nuance and judgment that has to go into these questions.
But even taking a view that there is too much carbon in the atmosphere and it must be reduced, perhaps there was a period of time when that was a consensus issue, but there are obviously growing actors on the right in British politics who don't agree with that view, and they do get disgruntled about it. And maybe because we don't necessarily agree with them, we don't see that as much of a problem, maybe our political class more generally. But I think these are areas which I feel somewhat uncomfortable with the monarchy straying into. Anyway, one other area you talked about, which I just want to push back on gently before we get on to Elizabeth II, is you said that the monarch can express a view on social and moral issues. I also think this is rather dangerous. And be interesting to see how you develop this with Elizabeth II. But in my judgment, she very rarely, if at all, made it expressly clear what her policy views were on, say, questions relating to abortion or divorce or same-sex marriage, insofar as she was prepared to give royal assent to bills that liberalized those issues, for example, but not necessarily because she agreed or disagreed with them. That is in contrast to the Belgian king in the 1990s, King Baudouin, who did make it very clear that as a committed Roman Catholic, he was opposed to abortion, and he refused to give royal assent to Belgium's liberalization of abortion law. And it became such a constitutional problem that the king had to abdicate for 36 hours in order for Parliament to pass the legislation liberalizing abortion in absence of a head of state, so that it would pass without royal assent. And then the monarchy was brought back after a 36-hour republic in order for that to happen. Now, that never happened under the Queen's reign, in spite of the fact that she possibly did have to sign moral and social bills that maybe she disagreed with. We know that she was a committed Christian, and maybe she had, not all Christians have problems with abortion or divorce, but some do. But she went along with anyway, and I congratulate her for that, and I think that's the right thing.
Again, there is nuance in there, which I feel may be being squeezed out ever so slightly by the Belgian comparison, because I'm certain that there were acts of Parliament in the Queen's reign that she did not agree with the substance of. It's said, for example, if we take something from the last couple of decades, that she was not big on the ban on fox hunting, that she was in fact opposed to the ban on fox hunting. She was a very country lady in many respects and would have known a great many people who did fox hunting. But nevertheless, she signed it into law herself because she could distinguish between what was her constitutional duty and what were her own opinions. But in a way, I'm glad that you mentioned both things that somebody says before they're sovereign and also moral and social issues, because that is in fact where I wanted to begin, because it is an example of something that the Queen said when she was just Princess Elizabeth in 1949, and she spoke to the Mothers' Union at Central Hall in Westminster. And she said something which was actually striking in its tone and speaks, I'm sure, of her personal views, but also of the period of time and of the age in which she was speaking. So she said to the Mothers' Union, we can have no doubt that divorce and separation are responsible for some of the darkest evils in our society today. And so clearly, in 1949 at least, she did not feel inhibited from saying things like that. In fact, she encouraged the audience at the time not to feel priggish for saying or thinking such things.
I think it's an extraordinary statement, and I wasn't aware of it until you told me about it before we recorded this podcast. I personally think it's not the kind of thing that a member of the royal family or the heir to the throne, and certainly not the monarch, should be saying. One can caveat it by saying that this was a different time when maybe divorce or opposition to divorce was more of a consensus issue than it is today. One might excuse it on a personal level with the Queen because of the context of the abdication and the fact that King Edward VIII had had to abdicate from the throne for marrying someone who was divorced and therefore, in the eyes of the church, still married to her ex-husband. So one could sort of see that the trauma of the abdication may have emboldened her willingness to talk publicly about it. But I think if any member of the royal family said something like that today, I think there would be huge controversy, and quite rightly so.
So that was an example of something which changes over time. And so is the second of them, really, which is times when Elizabeth II had to act politically, because in fact it was one of the duties of the job. So the best period in which to think about this, I think, is the 1950s and the choice of Prime Minister. So we've spoken in the past on this podcast. in part because it's what I've been writing a book about recently, about Conservative leadership elections and, before elections, Conservative leadership selections. And if you go back to the very first appointments that the Queen made as Prime Minister, the Conservatives were in power when she took to the throne in 1952. Winston Churchill was her first Prime Minister. But then in 1955, she had the duty to appoint a Prime Minister for the first time. And unlike today, there was no internal party mechanism for the party to choose its leader, who she would then obviously appoint. Now, there were all sorts of myths about the way in which, certainly at the time, a monarch might choose a Prime Minister. So sometimes people imagine that the outgoing Prime Minister would just whisper a name and then that person would be called to the palace to take over. Churchill himself, in fact, dismissed this idea and said, quote, "Once the Prime Minister resigns, he can't advise." He said separately, "The theory that the outgoing Prime Minister can just say, 'Oh, by the way, I think the person you ought to send for is so-and-so,' is rubbish." So Churchill didn't believe in that idea, and I think it is constitutionally unsound, the idea that a Prime Minister can choose their successor. At the time, in the 1950s in particular, the monarch was responsible for exercising the royal prerogative to appoint a Prime Minister. If the parties didn't have a mechanism for giving very clear advice about who it is that they should call for in exercise of that royal prerogative, then the monarch had actual political discretion about how they would form an opinion of who to invite to form a government. In 1955, as it happens when Churchill goes, it's a totally uncontroversial decision. Anthony Eden had been the heir apparent for an incredibly long time, and nobody else doubted that he would take over after Churchill. In that case, as it happens, the fact that the Queen didn't seek wide advice was actually significant in and of itself. That was a decision, in part, that she and the people around her had to make, not to really seek advice, but to go along with what was seen as a political consensus, that Eden was the natural successor. Similarly, in 1957, when Eden resigns, there is a much more difficult succession in which the Queen and the people around her have to decide who to invite to form a government out of the senior Conservatives in the country. And it's not obvious in the way it was 2 years earlier who that should be. And on that occasion, the Queen decides to consult Churchill as, with the exception of the outgoing Premier, the only other living Conservative Prime Minister, and also accepts the advice of two senior Conservative peers who, one by one, ask the Cabinet who they think should become Prime Minister, out of Harold Macmillan and Rab Butler. But in these cases, the key thing that really matters before both major parties have leadership elections is that the appointment of a Prime Minister is an exercise of the royal prerogative. And whilst that is not an area of total discretion, the question of not only who to appoint, but whose advice to accept on who to appoint, how much advice is required before determining who to appoint, what questions to ask them when you appoint them. For example, in 1963, two of the questions that the Queen had to ask Alec Douglas-Home when he was recommended to her by Macmillan was to get confirmation that he was willing to go to the House of Commons. He was at the time a member of the House of Lords. He was the Earl of Home. And his reassurance that he could form a government. And it then took 24 hours for him to be able to confirm that. So these aren't necessarily political judgments that the monarch at that time had to make, and Elizabeth II had to make in those contexts, although exercising of the royal prerogative no longer operates in the way that it once did.
I think that the scope for freedom of action for the monarch in these areas where maybe necessarily they have to make certain calls in exercise of their constitutional duties should be as limited as possible. In other words, I think the monarch should have as little discretion in the exercise of political judgment as they can, and that elected political officials or political parties that have an electoral mandate should be the ones that are in the driving seat. So when it comes to, for example, the appointment of prime ministers, this is now, I think, basically a decision that has been taken out of the monarch's hands. And the first place to look is the rule books of the governing parties to make that decision. And it's a good thing. This is a little bit of where I am a more legal than political person, but it's because I'm a Democrat at the end of the day that I think the parties should have a process however clearly spelt out, but it's a process that the parties should decide if, say, for example, there was some question or confusion about who the Prime Minister ought to be. Let's say a Prime Minister died in office or resigned suddenly and went off to Australia. It should be the party, not the palace, that decides who the individual is who succeeds them. Equally, I don't accept, and perhaps you'll disagree with me on this, Lee, I'm sure you will, actually. I don't accept that, for example, the monarch can reject advice from the Prime Minister. So some people claim there's these set of principles called the Lascelles principles, which refer to the Queen's private secretary, Tommy Lascelles, who anonymously wrote to the Times newspaper as Senex, setting out the conditions in which the monarch could refuse a Prime Minister's request for a dissolution of Parliament. I happen to think that this is nonsense. And I think if the Prime Minister requests a dissolution of Parliament, then the monarch should grant a dissolution of Parliament. Additionally, I certainly don't think the monarch has the right to dismiss a Prime Minister. Now, this is interestingly something that governors general operating in the name of the late Queen and current King have shown themselves willing to do. In 1975 in Australia, infamously, the Governor General, Sir John Kerr, dismissed the Labour Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, from office when Whitlam was going to see Sir John to request a dissolution of the Senate, and instead the Governor General dismissed the Prime Minister. I think that was an absolutely outrageous act, and it was the Governor General exercising effectively Crown power in Australia. Now, thankfully, Elizabeth II never herself personally did that, but others acting in her name did in the Commonwealth, and I think that is wrong, and I certainly wouldn't want a monarch to do that in this country. There's a very interesting book, by the way, on this, edited by Harshan Kumarasingham at Edinburgh University, called Vice-Regalism, which it may sound technical, but it's actually a brilliant book full of lots of different suggestions about this. And finally, just on this point, some people say that when Elizabeth II was given the advice to prorogue Parliament by Boris Johnson in 2019, as part of Johnson's efforts to deliver Brexit, in spite of the MP's efforts to thwart Brexit, the Queen should have, or could have, refused that advice and could have said, no, this is an illegitimate prorogation and I will not grant it. As it happened, she didn't do that, and MPs turned to the courts to stop the prorogation. I have all kinds of issues with that, and Miller too. I think the answer should have been the MPs should have just voted no confidence and brought down Boris Johnson through a political mechanism in the House of Commons. But some royalists would say, actually, the Queen could have exercised her judgment there, and I don't accept that. So basically, my view is the judgment of the monarch has to be the judgment of last resort, where there literally is a vacuum in decision-making. But where there is a democratic figure who can make a decision with some legitimacy, the Queen must follow, or now the King must follow that advice.
If I may, I think that's a little two-dimensional on at least two grounds. One of them being that it overlooks times when the parties, in fact, may want the monarch to exercise this role. So if you think still about the 1950s and into the early 1960s, Howard Macmillan writes in his diaries how he is determined to ensure that the Queen's ability to exercise the royal prerogative is maintained during the leadership transition. Similarly, throughout this time, there was no desire among the vast majority of people within the Conservative Party to create formal leadership rules, particularly not for when the party was in government, and the monarch's appointment of a Prime Minister, who the party would then retrospectively recognise as its leader, was the agreed and accepted way in which all those democratically elected people in the House of Commons who sat for the Conservatives, with very few exceptions, wanted the party to operate. So you can have this admittedly quite nuanced and complex arrangement in which the democratic parts of our politics actually want the monarch as a non-democratic part of politics to exercise some role. And I think it would be wrong to say that that is in and of itself undemocratic.
I think, though, that there's a different issue there, and that is that it then actually endangers the monarchy. And for the protection of the monarchy, you should not have democratic institutions delegating decisions that they can make to the crown. I mean, where will it all end? King Charles III will be put on the Conference Arrangements Committee of the Labour Party and get to choose which are the motions that are debated by the Labour Party conference, so long as that is within the rules of the Labour Party. I mean, it's absurd. I know you're not actually suggesting that, but the point I'm making is that just because the political party thinks, oh, wouldn't it be nice for the king or the queen to make this decision for us, doesn't mean that it's actually in the best interest of the monarchy to be making those decisions.
So that I agree with, and that is why I don't favour those arrangements continuing. But the key point is, you said it'd be undemocratic, and I don't necessarily think it is undemocratic. The second point I wanted to make is that I think there are examples where nobody but the monarch or the palace can in fact act in politics. For example, you said that the monarch cannot dismiss a prime minister legitimately, in your opinion. But let us say we had a situation in which there was a general election in which the opposition party won and the prime minister refuses to resign. What should happen in that case? Let's say that in 2024, Rishi Sunak decided, well, I'm going to wait until I meet the House of Commons and they will have to force a confidence vote in me before they can remove me as prime minister because I'm not going to resign the office. Would it not have been legitimate for the king to basically call Rishi Sunak to say, can you command the support of the new House of Commons? And if not, dismiss him? I think that would be a legitimate action.
No, because
to play.
You've given the answer away already, which is that the House of Commons should vote no confidence to remove him.
But then we have to wait days and days. Nobody can appoint a cabinet or ministerial positions because you've got one person, a prime minister, who is digging their feet in unnecessarily.
Well, actually, that used to be quite often the convention. The early 20th century prime ministers often didn't leave after an election until they lost a vote of no confidence. That's one of the reasons why, although it was the 1924 Labour government, it was actually as a consequence of the November 1923 general election, because it wasn't until Baldwin lost a confidence vote that then there was a replacement of him as prime minister. So I don't think that's...
Except that was going into a hung parliament situation, which is not sort of the example that I described. But I do actually want to come on to an example where the monarch may have to act in a hung parliament, because you said that if the prime minister requests, say, a dissolution of parliament, you rejected the Lascelles principles and says it wouldn't be right for the monarch to turn them down. Well, let's take the example of the February 1974 general election, when Edward Heath goes to the country, loses his majority, and has fewer seats than Harold Wilson's Labour Party. At that stage, because it was a hung parliament, Ted Heath stayed in Downing Street for several days. So let us say that in those days, when discussions were going on with the Liberals and others, Ted Heath decided, well, I don't think I'm going to come out of this well. Therefore, I'm going back to the palace and I'm going to ask the Queen, days after a general election, to dissolve Parliament again. Now, from what you described, do you think it would not be correct for her or the palace to turn around and say no? So we could be in an absurd situation in which a prime minister has gone to the country, lost his majority. There is a chance, as there was in that time, you've defended that brief Labour government in 1974 in the past as getting a huge amount done. There's an alternative prime minister, an alternative government that can be formed. But just because an outgoing prime minister refuses to be outgoing, there's another general election called. I mean, that would be an absurd situation for the country to be in.
The check in that is that that person would do very badly at the next election and it wouldn't even be close. But I don't think you would have that sort of scenario anyway. I mean, that...
But the protection against that scenario, though, is a palace and a monarch who can act in these situations.
That's such an extreme case. I mean, you remind me of Lady Hale. I mean, we don't...
Regular listeners will know that's about the worst thing that Richard could say to somebody. Crikey.
You don't design general constitutional principles on the basis of the most absurd and extreme potentiality.
No, you don't. But what you do have is you have somebody who can discreetly but effectively operate in the event of extraordinary and bad things happening. And I think that is a power which ought not be freely or regularly or willfully exercised by the monarch or by Elizabeth II in the examples we've kind of hypothesized, but that if they were essential, that it is much better that the monarch has the potential to step in and act and intervene than that they don't.
Well, possibly, but I mean, equally, the other check in this is the threat of revolution. And if our political leaders go mad, then we can go mad in return. And I mean, I think this just gets into such an absurd area of speculation.
Another theme I wanted to come on to talk about is an example where the monarch has to act in some sense politically in their own interests. So there's a big category of this, which is about the funding of the royal family. There's far too much detail and history involved in that about the way in which the civil list works or the sovereign grant works. That it's not something we can unpack in this episode. But there is an example that doesn't relate to royal finances that I wanted to mention. And that is from 1964 to 1965, when Tony Benn becomes Postmaster General in the new Labour government under Harold Wilson. Tony Benn, of course, would go on to become one of the lovable rogues of British politics. At the time, he was just a rogue. And Tony Benn decides that the Queen's head should come off the postage stamp. There is this international exception that the United Kingdom has for stamps, where we are the only country in the world that doesn't have the name of the country itself on the stamp. The monarch's image or the monarch's profile is sufficient. Anyway, up with this, Tony Benn would not put, and he decided that the Queen should come off it. First of all, he tries to do that by stealth. He tries to put Churchill's head next to the Queen's head on a very large stamp to try and reduce the importance of the Queen's head as a symbol on the stamps. Then he tries to go through the committee responsible, which, thank God, was largely staffed by good, traditional monarchists who were not very keen on the idea. And when he's getting nowhere with it, he decides to make his pitch to the Queen herself. And so on the 10th of March 1965, Tony Benn goes to Buckingham Palace to discuss with the Queen in what was meant to be a 15-minute audience, apparently, that lasts for 40 minutes, whether or not she should herself be removed from every letter in the country. He even takes with him examples of what these new stamps could look like. Now, thankfully, Tony Benn kept very good diaries, so we could know a little bit about what went on in this audience and around this time. And he asked her whether it was by her own command that he could not remove her head from the stamps. And she told him that she, in fact, had no particularly strong views on it. And Tony Benn left triumphant. And he became convinced, basically, as quite a lot of people have over the years, that there is this reactionary, conservative group of people around the Queen and around the palace, but that the Queen herself was not a part of that she was, in fact, a much more open-minded figure. And so he returns, he goes and talks to Harold Wilson, but then word comes back from the palace that the Queen, in fact, is not keen on this idea at all. And in the end, Harold Wilson and some of the civil servants around Tony Benn basically tell him just to drop it. And there's this question that gets asked about this situation where, to what extent is the Queen obliged to accept the advice of one of her ministers, particularly if it's the advice of one of her ministers about something in which she does have a legitimate interest, i.e. the use or the non-use of her own image. And the view that was determined at the time was that, well, if the Prime Minister, if Harold Wilson, who famously got on very well with the Queen, had a very strong and good relationship with the Queen, if Harold Wilson decided that he was to insist upon it himself, then ultimately the palace would have to back down. But up to that point, and including the monarch's ability or right to discuss it with the Prime Minister and to make her own views clear, that while she could not insist upon her position, she was entitled to make her view privately known, and in the absence of the Prime Minister opposing her, to win the day, which, of course, if you look at a postage stamp today, you will know that she did.
Well, I think that's mostly fine. I think that it's acceptable for the monarch through back channels to privately communicate the monarch's view. But I take very strongly the view that if the Prime Minister, or indeed a minister, is acting on behalf of the collective view of the government, And I think that's the question here with Ben, was he doing that, or had that not been a collective judgment that the government of the day had made? Or was that just his own initiative as Postmaster General? I suspect it was.
I think it's worth saying it was, yeah.
Then that I think is a different matter. But I think if this is a matter of government policy, if this is a view that cabinet has come to, if this is the collective view of the government, then the monarch must fall in line with what they are asked to do by the government.
Yes, and Elizabeth II herself would have agreed with that. This period in the early middle of her reign also brings up a particular question about words that the monarch may say publicly that could be seen as having a political angle. So if we zoom out ever so slightly, the 1970s is a fairly contentious time in British politics in lots of respects, but in particular for relations between Westminster and Scotland. So the Scottish National Party is very active and doing quite well electorally at this time. The discovery of oil in the North Sea is a great boon to the arguments of Scottish separatism, because a new independent Scotland would be much richer than people a few decades ago might have imagined it would be. And so whilst it's certainly far from a majority opinion in Scotland, there is a growing nationalism in Scotland. And this, in fact, leads to a referendum in Scotland about devolution at the end of the decade. And in 1977, the Queen celebrates a momentous moment in her own reign, which is a Silver Jubilee. She's been on the throne for 25 years, the first Silver Jubilee since George V. And as part of that, she does, as monarchs have done before, and she did subsequently, an address to Westminster Hall and both chambers of Parliament. And as part of that, she says, quote, "I cannot forget that I was crowned Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Perhaps this Jubilee is a time to remind ourselves of the benefits which union has conferred, at home and in our own international dealings, on the inhabitants of all parts of this United Kingdom." So the Queen is coming out basically as a unionist in 1977. Those remarks are interesting for a few reasons. One of them because they become controversial. There are some Scottish nationalists who complain about what it is that the Queen has said. Secondly, because number 10 basically distances itself from them. In particular, it says, "We did not write these words for the Queen. They are her words." And thirdly, because it makes me think, well, it is not an unreasonable position for even a politically neutral constitutional monarch to believe in the existence of the country of which they are head of state. That is, generally speaking, in my view, not that controversial. There are particularly charged times when that can be controversial, but in and of itself, I do not think somebody who is head of state saying that they believe in that state, even though there is a small minority who don't, is that controversial. But the fact it did cause a bit of a flare-up in the press and in politics opens up the question of, well, is it dangerous for the monarch to say something that anybody could disagree with? Because at that stage, the idea that the monarch or Elizabeth II could say things which were uncontroversial because they were the political consensus is basically undermined to the point that she cannot, in fact, say things that are meeting with an enormous consensus, because there may be some dissent.
Yeah, I mean, I think these words are quite remarkable. They're a little fruity, one might say, in their directness at the time of some political controversy. On the other hand, I probably actually do fall down on your side with this, Lee, that it is legitimate for the monarch to make this particular kind of statement, which is a defense of the nation state, of the country that is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and Britain and the British people, right? I mean, I think these are all things that are perfectly legitimate for the monarch to defend. To the extent that people would disagree with that, I think that's partly a symptom of the fact that in Britain, we are much, much more accommodating of secessionism than most other countries are in the world. Most other countries in the world do not think it's a legitimate or acceptable view in mainstream politics to advocate for the destruction of the country, the end of the country. And I'm sure some if we have any Scottish nationalist or other nationalist listeners, might get cross at me for saying this, but I think in Britain we're actually, as a sort of political culture, tolerant of the view that it's perfectly fine to advocate for the destruction of the country. In many other countries, including European countries, they are far less tolerant of that type of position. And I'm not saying it should be banned or anything like that, but what I am saying is that I think it's perfectly fine for the state not to be neutral on that question. So I think on that particular question, I think it's perfectly fine that the head of state is not neutral about the continuation of the state. So actually, although probably if the Queen talked us directly on almost any other political matter, I might say that's a bit of a problem. On this particular one, I think it's fine. But there is this point about the protection of the crown and whether it's judicious for the crown to keep riling up separatists within the polity. But that's a slightly different point.
I would agree they are different points, but they're connected points, and that's part of the ongoing dilemma and judgment that I think has to be made about monarchy in a democracy like ours. I think the point that I would tend to come down on is that where there is a very high degree of political consensus, it is fine for the monarch to have an opinion that is consistent with that consensus or act in a way that is consistent with that consensus, so long as they are respectful of the dissenting opinion. So actually, I think this is something which comes up much more often than we may think. So let's take, for example, the Scottish Parliament, the creation of the Scottish Parliament. The Queen was there to open it. That had been generated because of a referendum in Scotland to create that. There was still a dissenting opinion in Scotland that didn't want it. The Queen turning up to open it was an implicit signal of support for it as an institution.
I'm not sure I quite agree with your characterization there. With the Scottish Parliament, she, in effect, following the instructions of her government. Right? I think if the Blair government had said, Your Majesty, we've set up this Scottish Parliament, but we want it to be treated basically with the same level of respect as Hampshire County Council, so we really don't think you should be going there to open it. I think the Queen would definitely respect that and have to respect that. Whereas here, they say, we've set up this new Scottish Parliament and we would like you to open it. And the Queen said, well, yes, because my government has asked me to go and do this thing. So I think that's not really the Queen exercising political judgment.
Yes, I would overwhelmingly agree with that, except there are, presumably, and this takes us back in a way to the opening point, things that a government might ask the monarch to do where they would ask not to do it. But yes, so generally speaking, I agree that rather like the theme of the state opening of Parliament, the idea that they're acting on behalf or on the advice of the government as head of state is what shields the monarch and Elizabeth II, in this case, from actual controversy. Where it can become trickier is where advice isn't just coming from one government. Because, of course, Elizabeth II held multiple roles all at the same time. Of course, she was Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. In this country, she was also Supreme Governor of the Church of England. She was at the same time Queen of Canada, Queen of Australia, Queen of New Zealand, Queen of Jamaica, Queen of Papua New Guinea, Queen of St. Kitts and Nevis, Queen of some other places too. She was also, of course, head of the Commonwealth, made up of countries where she was head of state, but also plenty of countries where she wasn't head of state. And I think these largely complementary, but at times conflicting roles also throw up examples of where the monarch can act and at times has to act in a way that is a little bit political. So the mid-1980s is in fact a really good example of this. So big picture is that Margaret Thatcher and the Queen seem to have had a deeply respectful relationship of each other, but not a particularly warm or friendly relationship. So it is said that the Queen did not necessarily enjoy being in Margaret Thatcher's company, and I think the reverse was true as well. But I do think they had a great deal of respect for each other. That Thatcher was an undoubted and devoted monarchist.
She thought herself the Queen herself.
And the fact that the Queen gave her the Order of Merit, an honour that is in the Queen's own gift, very quickly after she ceased to be Prime Minister, I think is very telling of the respect in which she held Margaret Thatcher as well. And of course, the fact that she only went to two of her Prime Minister's funerals, Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher. I think that is also notable. in the mid-1980s, they were certainly disagreeing about certain things. And one of the things that they disagreed on was about sanctions for South Africa. So 48 of the 49 Commonwealth countries backed a package of economic sanctions against South Africa in response to the racist regime of apartheid that was operating in the country. The sanctions would have included a ban on air travel and investments in South Africa, as well as bans on agricultural imports from the country and so on. The one country that was dissenting was the United Kingdom. So Margaret Thatcher was opposed to the sanctions. Not, it's worth saying, because she was in favour of apartheid. She wasn't in favour of apartheid. She had very strong moral objections to apartheid. And behind the scenes, she did lobby the South African government, among other things, to release Nelson Mandela. But she generally objected to sanctions because she favoured freer trade. And she also believed that sanctions wouldn't work and that they would damage Britain's economic interests. So what you have at this stage is a position in which the British government, the elected British government, acting on behalf of the United Kingdom, and the British head of state wearing both the crown of this country but also the hat as head of the Commonwealth, and wanting to act as a good head of the Commonwealth, where there is an overwhelming majority in favour of economic sanctions, has to be reconciled. And what the Queen chose to do was to basically work and manoeuvre behind the scenes in order to try and get agreement for what ended up being a diluted form of sanctions against South Africa, but that the British government did ultimately agree to. But I think that's an example of where there is a divide in what is usually the quite easy judgments that a monarch has to make about whose advice or whose guidance to follow, and where there has to be some discretion on the part of the monarch about how to fulfill their role.
Yeah, I think this is quite a tricky thing that is perhaps more acute for the head of state of the United Kingdom than any other head of state. And I suppose, generally speaking, these conflicts in the role of the, say, the Queen of the United Kingdom and the Queen of Canada should not come into conflict. But there are occasions where, particularly with respect to diplomacy, use of the head of state for one of the Commonwealth realms may not be appropriate for the diplomacy of another Commonwealth realm. I mean, we've seen this a little bit recently with Canada and Britain with respect to the Trump administration, where certainly before the Iran war, it was the stated policy of the Starmer government to cuddle up as close to Donald Trump as they would let him, whereas it was the policy of the Carney government in Canada to put some water between the United States and Canada. And insofar as the king is being used by the United Kingdom to try to draw the United States closer to Britain, the king had to make sure that in his role as King of Canada, he wasn't compromising the desire that Canada had to actually put some distance between Canada and the United States. So it's a very tricky thing. And the example you gave with respect to the Commonwealth and apartheid, I suppose, is one such example.
I think those two examples as well actually show how successful Elizabeth II, but also now the King, are in fulfilling that role as well. I mean, it was a tricky time for the Queen in the mid-1980s because there were newspaper splashes about divides with Margaret Thatcher and disagreements with the way the government was acting. So it did not go perfectly smoothly. What I think did go incredibly smoothly, though, was the King's visit to Canada and the way in which the King handled that. And I think he wore his dual mandate with relative ease and to great effect, which I think was an example of how, when it does have to act to some degree politically or to balance judgments, the palace has actually become very effective at doing it.
And the final context in which you believe that the monarch can behave politically, Lee, is with respect to moral and social issues. So perhaps you can explain that a bit more through an example from Elizabeth II's life, because that was one of those areas where I was rather dubious in the abstract.
Yes, so what I mean by this really is that the late Queen did feel that she had quite a bit more latitude to make comments about what she thought was a desirable way for society to operate or to organize itself or to look in terms of how people responded to one another. And this actually does relate a little bit to the dual mandate point because of her role as Supreme Governor of the Church of England. And clearly, she did see herself as being not a competitor to the Archbishop of Canterbury, but a supporting figure in terms of promoting the Anglican Church and Christianity in this country. Somebody did say around the time that she died in 2022 that she was probably the most effective evangelical that this country's had in the last century, and I think that's probably correct. I think more people probably heard her talk about matters of faith and religion and what it meant to her than almost anybody else. And I think associated with that, she did feel that she could make some comments which, say, aren't necessarily political, but do speak to some degree about a political vision, but where there are certainly political visions which would not be compatible with some of the things that she said, and in that sense are about political judgment. So, for example, she said in her 2004 Christmas message, "Most of us have learned to acknowledge and respect the ways of other cultures and religions, but what matters even more is the way in which those from different backgrounds behave towards each other in everyday life. There is certainly much more to be done and many challenges to be overcome. Discrimination still exists. Some people feel that their own beliefs are being threatened. Some are unhappy about unfamiliar cultures. They all need to be reassured that there is so much to be gained by reaching out to others, that diversity is indeed a strength and not a threat. We also need to realize that peaceful and steady progress in our society of differing cultures and heritage can be threatened at any moment by the actions of extremists at home or by events abroad. We can certainly never be complacent." Most of us, I think, will consider those to be quite benign terms. But if we're honest with ourselves, there are people in this country who are unhappy about unfamiliar cultures. In fact, she names them explicitly. She sets out that she is disagreeing with some people's view of how society looks in 21st century Britain. And she also explicitly calls out extremists at home. So she is, in fact, actively choosing to say there are people in this country who disagree with what I'm saying now, but I'm saying it anyway, because I happen to believe it is correct. And I think that is therefore unavoidably a political statement that Elizabeth II chose to make.
It is quite striking in how political it sounds for the Queen to say, diversity is indeed a strength. I think today, if the King said that, there would be voices on the right from Reform and on GB News and in other outlets who would be perhaps a bit annoyed to hear that. So it's quite interesting. But what I would say is I think that this is an example of the monarch operating at the level of broad consensus, maybe a little bit where there isn't. But I think when the monarch's talking about extremists at home and abroad, I think she's probably talking about Islamist terrorists, which I think, obviously, if this is coming not long after 9/11, I think I don't think there's I think there's a consensus view that Islamist terrorism or terrorism of any sort is not to be welcomed. The other thing I would say about this is it doesn't run against the government's view at all. It runs very, very squarely with the government. So I think if you had a reform government, let's say, or a restore government, a government that basically argued that diversity is not a strength and that Britain should be a less diverse country, and that is the policy of the government, that if the monarch then made a speech like this, where the monarch said diversity is indeed a strength, then I think that would be going beyond what the constitutional position of the monarch is, regardless of what our own support of that view might be. But because this was the age of New Labour and Tony Blair, and multiculturalism had a much bigger buy-in then, I don't think it's quite as political as maybe even it sounds today.
It's undeniable that consensus shifts, and that is one of the perils for monarchy, certainly when judged outside of the context in which they were operating, that things which at the time, say, seemed pretty benign and uncontroversial do in fact take on a different potency beyond that. And to wrap this episode up about how political was Elizabeth II, in my general view, and there's lots of nuance and there's lots of challenge, and I accept the pushback that you've offered on these things. My general view is that to be head of state is to unavoidably be involved in politics in some way. But how you do that and the extent to which you do that requires an enormous number of constant judgments about not being party political, not being used by politicians, avoiding outright controversy, to managing conflicts and challenges well. And these are the sorts of challenges, when we look back on the life of Elizabeth II, that I think we can say she judged extremely well. When people often say about the late Queen, she never put a foot wrong, of course, there's challenge to that itself. She did make mistakes, of course. She was human like any of us. But I think these sorts of judgments, which are full of peril in the modern age for constitutional monarchs, are ones that she judged incredibly effectively. And the strength of the British monarchy in the early 21st century, in spite of new and unpredictable challenges, which of course it has faced in recent years, in part, I think, stems from the stewardship that she gave the crown in her unprecedentedly long reign.
Yeah, and I have to say, I mean, given the length of her life and reign, for us to go through those most political moments, and really we're sort of quibbling about degrees of emphasis and very subtle uses of language, I think speaks to how, in my view, she was a model monarch from a constitutional perspective, that she really didn't exercise influence over politics insofar as it was possible for her to avoid doing so. And I think that's very much to her credit. And I would just add to that, that I think as a human being, there might have been moments where she was intensely tempted to make use of her position and prestige and iconic status to try to push political waters in certain directions. And the fact that she refrained from doing so, I think, is actually in itself really admirable. I have to say, if I was monarch, that'd be a good jolly, wouldn't it? But if I was monarch, I think I would find it at moments of great national debate and crisis and intense moments to just sort of push things one way or another. And the fact that she basically refrained from doing so outside of these narrow exceptions of, say, showing that she was a supporter of the continuation of the state of which she was the head of state, which I think is a completely legitimate position for her to take, shows what a great constitutional monarch she really was.
Before we come on to talk about the books we're reading at the moment, if you've enjoyed this discussion about how political Elizabeth II was, we're doing a bonus episode this week on our Patreon in which we'll look at what were the politics of Elizabeth II based on what she said, what she did, and what we can infer from the two. Some of the topics we'll be looking at there are: to what extent was the Queen a philosophical conservative? To what extent is any constitutional monarch actually a philosophical conservative? Did the way in which she handled Tony Blair's honours show that she had particular beef with that Labour Prime Minister? Why is it that Margaret Thatcher once despaired to somebody that if the Queen was an ordinary commoner who could vote in general elections, that she would vote for the Social Democratic Party, the SDP, in the 1980s? And is there any reason to think that the Sun splash in 2016, Queen backs Brexit, was in fact true, or was it simply misbehaving? That will be out on the Patreon this week, and there's a link to that in the show notes. But to wrap up this episode, Richard, why don't you tell us what you're reading at the moment?
Well, actually, what I'm going to suggest to our readers this week is the book that I mentioned earlier in the podcast, Vice-Regalism, The Crown as Head of State in Political Crises in the Post-War Commonwealth, edited by Harshan Kumarasingham. This is unfortunately an extremely expensive book. it's published by one of those extractive academic publishers. But if you have library access to get the book, it is great fun and interest. I think it will be of some interest, particularly to our Since Attlee Churchill listeners. It is a book that talks about many of the themes that we've talked about how political can an unelected head of state be within the Commonwealth. And there are chapters that are about the United Kingdom. So there's a chapter about the 1963 Conservative leadership election. There's a chapter about Scotland. But there are also chapters about governors general. There's a picture of Sir John Kerr, the infamous Governor General of Australia, who dismissed Gough Whitlam, the Labour Prime Minister, in 1975, on the front cover. There are also chapters about, for example, what does the Crown do when there is a communist revolution in a Commonwealth realm? Does the Queen remain a head of state in a Commonwealth realm that has succumbed to Marxism? Does the Crown allow for the Crown to be used in ways that could be justifying human rights abuses? What are the limits of the Crown's neutrality? So it speaks very much to the themes of this episode. And if you can get your hands on it, I think it's a great book.
Well, I wanted to mention this week the book that I dipped back into in preparation for this episode. I think of the books I've read in life, I think I've read more books about Elizabeth II than I have any other subject. That's partly because I am just an instinctive and deep monarchist and a particular devotee of the late Queen.
You're her biggest fan.
A great fan of the Kings as well. And there are many good books about the Queen. There's plenty of bad books too, but there are many good books about the Queen, and certainly a lot that are published in the popular press that are very readable about the Queen. But the one that I always go back to as being the best that I've read is Ben Pimlet's book. So Ben Pimlet is somebody who political history obsessives love in general, particularly for his seminal biography of Harold Wilson.
The best.
And what I think makes his book about Elizabeth II so compelling for those of us who share interests in this little Since Attlee and Churchill community we do, is that he treats the Queen as a political figure in many respects. He sees her as being part of the British polity. And in fact, Tim Shipman says, it's on the cover of the latest iteration of this book, he says it's the only one that seriously deals with her constitutional and political role. And I think that's right, and deals with it incredibly well. Now, the great tragedy is that Ben Pimlet died when he was only in his 50s in 2004. So it doesn't go right up to the very end of Elizabeth II's reign. But if you're happy to basically go through to the millennium, then it is, I think, a superb account of the role and the significance of Elizabeth II. We'll have links to those books in our show notes, but that's all for this episode of Since Attlee and Churchill. As I say, there'll be a follow-up to this on the Patreon in the coming days, so do look out for that. The link is in the show notes. Otherwise, we'll be back on Thursday. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.